All Trombley.
Good morning, Monday again. Andy Brownell, Rochester Today, News Talk 1340, KROC AM 96.9 FM. And like we do every month, we have a chance to chat today with Rochester Public Schools Superintendent Kent Pekel. Oh, darn it, Kent. I know what I forgot to do. I was going to introduce you with bumper music, Muskrat Love.
Oh, my God. You read the interview.
I'll tell you this, but I have a high opinion of you, Kent. It did get a little bit diminished after reading the interview. That was a mistake. That was a fail. I've made larger ones, but Steve Lang did a good interview. I'll be honest. We had after hours. We did the interview while having a beer, and I think the skill of the interviewer and maybe the beer caused me to divulge that my first concert was Captain and Tennille at the Minnesota State Fair. And I have no idea. I'm not going to pretend like that I somehow didn't like that music, but I have no direct recollection of why I went with my dad to the Minnesota State Fair to see Captain and Tennille. It wasn't like my favorite kind of music, but it was like you had a T-shirt. It was. I did not have a T-shirt. I didn't know all the. I knew the song "Love Will Keep Us Together" actually, and then when Steve mentioned the song "Muskrat Love," I probably buried that deep in the recesses of my subconscious. But I knew the song "Love Will Keep Us Together," and somehow or another, my dad and I had tickets to the grandstand at the State Fair, and then he was like, "Oh, that's not good." My second concert was Supertramp, so that was a little better. You redeemed yourself. I know. He said, "Oh, you should have started with your second." And of course, I'm not going to lie. I sat there and said, "Why didn't I lie?" And I didn't lie. And now, especially if you had played Muskrat Love, "Love Will Keep Us Together," I can live with that. But and of course, everybody of a certain age has no idea who we're talking about at all. That's fine. I have an old jukebox, and to my own horror, Muskrat Love is in that jukebox. There you go. I've tried to get it out of there, but others involved say, no, you can't take it out. So, I was literally, all my kids who didn't grow up in Rochester, they're either in college or out of college, and they were here this summer, and the day that Rochester magazine came out, and we were having lunch at Pasquale's. And one of the guys brought over the magazine and said, "Look, your dad is the interview in Rochester magazine." So, of course, they're all looking at it. Not one of them knew who Captain and Tennille was. Not one of them. Well, that worked out in your favor, though. I know, until that magazine. So I'm sadly forever branded by them. But, I guess there's honor in truth. Your transparency burned you a little bit. It did. But it was fun. It was a fun interview and a nice opportunity to talk about some kind of personal things too. Yeah, Steve's a good guy. I've known him for decades now. It's we joked about that a little bit when I saw that in the magazine, to say the very least. If he ever interviews me again, it's going to be all lies all the time. But I'm going to make myself look good. So. Oh, boy, I don't even know where to start today. We have a lot to cover, but I guess maybe before we take a break, we've been in school now, 3-4 weeks? You started before Labor Day, so almost a month. Yep, a month. And I know a big aspect of getting things together for the school year was a complete remake of the transportation system. And I've said to you before, it gives me a headache even to think about how complex that is. And I guess maybe check in with you. How have things gone since day one? The first thing in answering that question is to remember why we did it, and that was to get to our new start times. And our new start times, which have elementary students starting school at 8 a.m. instead of 9:20, basically, or 9:25, have been a quantum leap. They have been good for little kids and learning, and as you know, we did not move high school or middle schoolers to the crack of dawn. So the why we did it has played out well. It has on the whole gone really well. I mean, it's more than 11,000 kids in a 218 square mile school district, and so it is complex. There have been two issues that we're working on very much in our schools that are known as district-wide option schools, which used to have busing from anywhere within those 218 square miles. We created a hub system, which takes them to a school that's somewhat more distant from their school than their neighborhood school and gives them another bus ride.
And we've had a lot of buses in some of those hubs, which has slowed the transfer. And so we're looking at a slight tweak to the schedule and the district-wide option schools to essentially get those kids there a bit earlier before the other buses come. And the second thing has been it has taken longer, especially at John Marshall, for the buses to get from picking up kids at the middle schools and taking them home to the high school. So we've had some waits in the high school there as well.
That could be an issue before.
Yeah, that was actually our biggest concern. And what was interesting, and some people said, well, why did you do that? We heard from many, especially coaches and administrators, that 3:30 needed to be the very last bell at high school. Well, we're finding that actually lengthening that day somewhat would have kids getting picked up without the wait, which has gotten much better at Mayo and Century, but has been a real issue at JM. And of course, the weather's nice now, so it's not as cold. So one option we're going to look at is slightly lengthening lunch within the high schools, and then the high schools would go about 15 minutes more. Our high school kids in Rochester go to school a lot of minutes. We're quite a bit over the required amount that the state requires. So, we cut it back a couple of years ago further to shorten our lunches. And so I guess the big takeaway is, on the whole, it's gone quite well. Those are the two issues. And, every once in a while, people, I think, assume that either we're unaware of stuff like this, but especially that we're not going to do anything to fix it. And as I hope I just said, we have two potential fixes that we're looking at for those issues. Now, the challenge is that bus system that literally moves hundreds of buses every day is literally mapped out once a year. And then, you change it for this kid moves in, this kid's family moves, but it's literally set for a year. So changing it mid-year is not a simple thing, but we are looking at what some of the adjustments might be that might address those two issues that I mentioned.
All right. I think I told you off the air, but I had a experience as a middle schooler. Well, it was junior high back in the caveman days, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my first time riding a school bus, other than to field trips or whatever it may be, and I was quite timid, to say the least. I rode the bus home, and the bus driver drove past my neighborhood, and I just assumed, they'll circle around, and it must be some sort of route that doesn't make any sense to me, but the older bus driver, he must know what he's doing. Well, no, it was a mistake. I ended up riding the bus all the way to John Marshall High School, where the high school kids were getting out of. The bus driver is, what are you still doing on my bus?
Mm-hmm.
And to make a long story short, I was on the bus for probably a good 2 hours or more that day, because he ran the John Marshall kids home, and when they got to my neighborhood, he made a special stop right in front of my door to let me out. And I guess the lesson of the story was, in the overall scheme of things, no harm, no foul. Got home safely. The cops weren't called. There was no missing persons alerts, and it probably ended up being a positive experience for me. Maybe a little less timid from that moment forward.
I think, especially because you ended up safe and you ended up getting where you needed to be eventually, there was probably something that was developmentally beneficial for you in that experience.
I agree.
We really, there is such a thing as kind of helicopter parenting or helicopter caregiving, and there is an understandable desire to shield kids from any kind of negative experience like that. But as somebody who, both as a teacher and administrator, but also who spent more than a decade doing research on youth development, there is an indispensable set of skills and perspectives that were encapsulated in that experience that you just had. Oh my gosh, things are not working out. Wait a minute, this bus driver still seems concerned about me, but the world is not revolving around me right now. Like, he's not, we're not going right back and forget the high school kids. And I'm having to stay controlled, and I'm, having to get through this. And in the end, guess what? It was okay. And so I don't mean to suggest to parents out there that if we have a late bus or a missed bus, that you should be happy about it because it's developmentally beneficial. But I do think we don't do our kids a disservice when we don't help them just learn to live with experiences like that one you had. And think about it, you manage it, remember it all these years later. And so
I look back at it as a funny story.
Yeah. Yeah. And it, may not have been then, but, had that happened, or frankly, it sounded like your parents did not freak out,
No, they didn't.
Because then the other, I don't want to.
I don't want to. In the 1970s, you didn't freak out over anything.
Well, there's that. But if the young Andy had seen the parents freak out about that, which our kids sometimes do see their parents and caregivers freak out, what are they going to do when they run into some adversity? They're going to freak out. Like when you see that sort of moment of adversity, and the first response is, "You're an idiot. How could you do this?" As opposed to, "Oh, it's the first week of a new transportation system. This was not good. I need you to know about it. I'd like to know how you're going to address it, but I'm not going to actually go from 0 to 60 right away." I think it's a nice story. So thanks for sharing it.
All right. Well, you know what? We better take a break. We're talking with Rochester Public Schools Superintendent Kent Pekel, our monthly chat about Rochester's education system. We'll return in a moment on News Talk 1340 KROC AM at 96.
All Trombley.
Welcome back. Andy Brownell, Rochester Today with Kent Pekel, Rochester Public Schools Superintendent on News Talk 1340 KROC AM at 96.9 FM. Kent, when we spoke in August, it was right before the results of the latest MCA assessments, or Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments, were released. And we weren't able to talk about the results. We talked about testing in general. I guess for folks who had not read up on this or heard about it, what was the outcome?
Andy, it was some very preliminary and qualified but unquestionable good news. We reversed a 10-year decline in the percent of our kids in Rochester who are proficient in both math and science, and an 8-year decline in literacy. And the test, the MCAs, measures the percentage of our kids from elementary school through high school that are meeting our state standards in reading, math, and science. And then the state, like most states, uses math and literacy, or math and reading, as what they call their accountability subjects. So there's the raw test score data, and then there's the data that they recalculate. For instance, if a student has been in your school for less than half a year, in what they call the North Star accountability calculation, they take that kid out because they figure, well, we shouldn't assume it's your school's education because the kid wasn't even there half a year. So when you use that North Star accountability calculation, the percentage of our kids who are proficient in reading increased by 2.2 percentage points, the percentage of our kids in math by 3.8 percentage points, and the percentage of kids in science by 1.2 percentage points. The science score is the raw data, and our math and reading increased. The raw data increased as well, but the North Star accountability way of tracking it is the way the state, tracks schools and identifies schools that require intervention, of which I'm happy to say the state does not believe Rochester has any. So 1 year of data does not a trend make, but I think it's very good to see it headed in another direction, not in the wrong direction. And the thing about the MCAs too is that we went up in all subjects, and we went up elementary, middle, and high school. And I think that's important because, like, my first year, as you may remember, we had a really good increase in our graduation rate. And then the second year, it was almost back to where we started. But a graduation rate is one cohort of kids. It's one group of 12th graders versus another group. So it's not that unusual to see a big fluctuation because for lots of reasons, one cohort of kids can be very different than another cohort. Yeah. But when we're looking at the MCAs, we were looking at all three subjects across elementary, middle, and high school. So I think it's an encouraging sign about the work that our teachers and administrators and all staff are doing, and of course, ultimately, what the kids did themselves.
And I obviously very hopeful that it is the start of a trend.
Of course. I mean, that's what we want to see is a start of a trend. And we also want to start to unpack, some of that data. We had some of our schools that we were calling leading edge schools. And, like Willow Creek, we saw an 18.9% increase in their math proficiency, 18.9 percentage points, and 15.4 in literacy, and I put in place a new leadership team at Willow Creek a couple of years ago. Their discipline rates headed in a completely different direction. And there are many, many other schools that we saw make John Adams, Mayo, Bishop, Century, Sunset Terrace, Washington, Gage, and math. Mayo, Bamber Valley, John Marshall, and literacy. So we're also going to be looking at those schools that got some of those gains. And then we're going to look at our subgroups of kids, too, because, we want all kids to get better, but we want the kids who are furthest behind to increase the fastest. And so, for instance, in math, we saw our American Indian kids go up by 11 percentage points. In reading, we saw our Black African American students go up 5.8 percentage points. So I think some hopeful signs, but you're right. What we really want to see is a long-term trend.
Do you have any, comparisons to the state as a whole, looking at what the Rochester schools did?
Yeah, the state as a whole was flat.
Okay.
And so we looked different than the state. And again, I try not to spend too much time talking about the past, because the past is the past. But during those years when Rochester was seeing sustained multi-year declines in reading and math, the state was flat or slightly going up. And so, we looked a bit different than the state this year. Again, I don't say that to be triumphalist, and we could be here a year from now and I could be talking about very different situation. In fact, I would predict, if I had to predict, because we are implementing a new reading curriculum this year from K to 5, so our teachers are learning a completely new way to teach reading in a new curriculum while they're teaching kids. I think it's possible we'll see a decline in literacy next year. And in the corporate world, they often call that an implementation dip, where when you first adopt something very new, your performance goes down a bit before it actually gets better. I hope that's not the case, but, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so what you want to be doing is seeing, the long view. And I think this was a good pivot point for us.
All right. And you mentioned unpacking the data. What does the school district do with this data as far as implementation of programs? Is there useful information to be gleaned from it?
There is. All the MCAs are a not particularly what we call instructionally useful test. They're designed to measure the system as opposed to an individual kid. And that's a pretty complex measurement difference. But the basic issue is if you want to know how much math a kid can do or how well they can read, you need to ask them multiple questions on the same skill in order to be sure they've got it or be sure they don't. And you have to do it so I can make a decision on, does young Andy really understand this skill? For the MCAs, they often ask one question for each kid. So that doesn't really tell us anything about Andy, but it tells us a lot about Andy's grade, school, or district because we combine them all.
Sure.
So what the MCAs do is they give us a spotlight on the system pieces. So we're looking at those leading edge schools and subgroups to say, what positive might have happened here? And we are also absolutely looking at those places where we saw a movement in a different direction. We give a shorter test that is useful called FastBridge in both reading and math. And that we use much more for actually how do we group kids? How do we provide them with, reading specialist time? How do we give them more challenge or go back and fill in some gaps? So the FastBridge score, our research director has done the statistical work to figure out what level a kid needs to get on the short, useful FastBridge score to predict their score later in the spring on the MCA. So we actually will be focusing much more on the FastBridge score because that tells you what I need to do with this kid in front of me. If we do that right, there's reason to believe the MCA scores will continue in the right direction over time. Whereas looking back at the MCA scores, in some ways it's almost absurd because those kids are not even in your class anymore.
Right.
They took it in third grade. Now they're off in fourth grade. I've got a new group of third graders. So spending a ton of time with that is actually retrospective instead of like the kids that are in front of me.
Sure, I understand. Yeah.
Sorry for the long nerdy discussion.
No, it's a complicated issue too, and why somebody tests well and another person doesn't test well on any specific day is a whole other variable
Absolutely.
that comes into this.
Yep.
All right, it's already time for a news break. Rochester Public Schools Superintendent Kent Pekel with us, and we'll return in a moment on Rochester Today, News Talk 1340, KROC-AM and 96.com. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Rochester Today, Monday morning. I'm Andy Brownell. News Talk 1340, KROC-AM and 96.9 FM, along with Rochester Public Schools Superintendent Kent Pekel. Kent, last week, the school board held a study session and talked about something you and I have talked about previously on this program, and that would be what if the referendum, which is 6 weeks away or less, fails to pass. That must have been a difficult meeting.
It was. And the reason we had it was because we also heard after the narrow failure of the referendum last year in November of 2023, and then my announcement that we were going to close schools and restructure attendance boundaries and cut programs, to the surprise of many people, even though we had said it was going to happen. We've heard this time, tell us what will happen if it doesn't pass. The tension of that, of course, is that it is October, not June. And the state budget, the school district sets its budget at the end of June, because over the course of the next 8 months, we're going to learn what our actual salary and benefit costs are based on our labor contracts, what actually will be our health insurance contributions, which is determined by how many of our employees got sick, before, our enrollment projections. What does the state of Minnesota do? What does the federal government do? Where does our local levy come in exactly? And then utilities costs, fuel, things like that. So all that is an unknown, but we know that if the referendum doesn't fail, we will have to cut at least $16.7 million. And we know that because $10 million this year is from Mayo Clinic, which is not, that check is not in the mail again for next year and wouldn't expect it to be. And $6.7 million is our budget reserve. And you can't keep using your reserve. So we know, I think it will be significantly more. Our structural deficit is slightly less than 20 million, but we know if it doesn't pass, we'll have to cut 16.7 million. And so that's what I said to the school board. And we had a really complex and difficult discussion about how you give people an understanding of the consequences of the referendum not passing without jumping ahead of all those things I just mentioned that we don't yet know, because we can't do an accurate budget for the 2025-2026 school year until we know all those things that I just mentioned, and they're not known right now. And yet our community said we want to know something before the election. So what I did was I outlined 4 broad categories that I think would be the ones I would recommend, as difficult as they are, that we would need to look at if the referendum passes. And those would be closing 3 elementary schools, increasing our class sizes by an average of 3 students, making major cuts in positions here at the central office, and then the non-instructional positions, not teachers at the building level. The teacher cut is the class size cut. And then there's 4 investment areas in our referendum proposal that would provide 10 years of funding if it passes. If that doesn't happen, those 4 areas would also have to take major cuts. So we're going to have board meetings this week and next week, and the board will have a chance to vote on a resolution that would attempt to give people a clear sense of what will happen, but without, frankly, making specific commitments that we need more time and, frankly, more public input on before I would recommend them to the board for action.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. How specific could you be, particularly identifying what schools might be affected?
So this was a big discussion at the board level, and you and I were in some ways just a moment ago talking about the transportation changes we made this fall, and I kind of said, but I said it a little less directly than I'm going to say now. We listen. When we get feedback, we listen. We go back to the data. We look at the issues, sometimes ones we didn't see. We definitely saw that last year with our attendance option redesign. We're seeing it this year, this fall, with our transportation piece. So the problem with naming which 3 schools we would cut is not only have we not done some analytic work that we need to do in terms of where do kids live and where could they go instead of those schools. Because if you close a school and the only school that they could realistically go to because of capacity is another one of those hour-long bus rides, we've just tried to save money by closing a school and ballooned the transportation cost. So we have to look at the enrollment patterns and where could the kids go. The second thing we'd look at is the condition of the schools. We have a lot of 70, 80-year-old buildings, and sometimes it would seem, well, close an old one. Well, that's not always necessarily the most effective decision. So First of all, there is some work that we would need to do, and we would do that quite quickly. As you may remember, last year after the referendum failed in early November, by the middle of December, I was recommending specific schools for closure. But then the second piece is all the input that we got in response to that recommendation. Now, because Mayo Clinic stepped in with that contribution last year, we were able to pull back the closures of schools altogether. But we got a lot of very specific feedback that was very important to get, that had I had to close schools, I would have factored into a revised proposal for the school closures. So, and in fact, the state of Minnesota requires you to have a public hearing before you close a school. So, that's even, not negotiable that you'd have to do it. But more than that, closing a school it's hell. It's like a death in the community. There's no other way. It's a very emotional thing. It's very emotional. There's no other way to put it. And so to name the schools that we would close right now jumps over both that internal analysis and the public input process. And it won't surprise you, probably a lot of people. I'm focused right now on supporting students and staff and having a great school year, and supporting the community in making a decision on the referendum. I am providing with information as much as I can. I am not spending my time planning for the failure of the referendum at this time. There are only so many hours in the day. And right now, my focus is making sure that people, when they cast their vote on November 5th, do so whether they vote against the referendum or for it, with the knowledge of what it is and what the consequences would be.
Okay, and you and I have talked about the referendum quite a bit in previous programs, but obviously we're getting very close to a vote. When you're out speaking to community members, I've asked you this question before, but are there any particular questions that you're getting or perhaps that it would illuminate what might be misunderstandings or gaps in knowledge?
A new one since you and I talked that has been coming up is some assumption that the city of Rochester funds Rochester Public Schools. And I get it. Like, people who don't follow school funding, they might think that is the way it works. We're actually, like every community in Minnesota, we're entirely separate from the city. The city has massive responsibilities of their own. And they have a funding stream, as does the county, that does not require them to go to the voters directly. School districts need to do that. So as I've been out in lots and lots of community meetings, organizations, every once in a while someone says, well, why doesn't the city just increase your funding? And I say, well, actually, because there's no mechanism to do that. That happens nowhere. All of the laws are set up for the state of Minnesota, the federal government, and then local property tax payers to fund schools. And that's not something that, should Mayor Norton want to change that tomorrow, she couldn't. That's just not how the city works. So that's been one. And look, I get it. I mean, the issues that are there for, every family with those financial challenges are real. But we are not crying wolf. We have a structural deficit. We've cut $20 million since I've been here, more than 150 positions. So we've made hard decisions. But we're at a point where we've, cut through the flesh and we're into bone. And so the consequences of this referendum not passing will be serious for our community.
I know the materials on the website, and you've talked about this as well. You do a comparison for school systems of comparable size, as far as enrollment is concerned, and levels of local school funding available to those districts. And Rochester, obviously, as you pointed out, is at the bottom.
We're at the bottom of the school districts that serve 10,000 or more students in the state. So there's 15 of them, and we're 15 out of 15.
What kind of response are you getting to that piece of information when you speak to these community groups?
A lot of people are very surprised. Doesn't feel like that to them. Some people want to have a real discussion about why that is. And of course, I don't not only does it predate me in Rochester, but I think it's very, very, complex. We could have a long discussion about, why that is the case. What's within my power to say is that if the referendum passes, Rochester would not go from being like 15 out of 15 to being number 1 out of 15. We would go to being number 10 out of 15. And we would still be below the average local voter approved support for the 15 school districts that serve 10,000 or more kids in the state. We would be at $2,076 per student, and the average is $2,196 per student. And so it's not a quantum leap to the top tier, but it is a meaningful increase that would be very, very beneficial for our kids in our system, because it would put us in a place of financial stability.
And some folks have raised the question of why do the comparison with just the larger school districts? Why not incorporate some of the smaller districts throughout the state as far as level of funding per pupil? I guess my question leads me to the question: are there significant differences in the cost of running a large system compared to running one of these smaller systems?
Yes, there are significant differences in those costs, and there are significant differences in the local property tax contributions. If you look at our surrounding smaller communities and what their community residents pay to their school districts, in many instances, it is significantly higher than in Rochester. And so the cost of running a 2,000 student or 2,500 student district, there are some benefits to bigness, the economies of scale, and then, of course, the tax base that we're fortunate to have in Rochester. But the scale, the reason that I believe comparing us to those school districts that serve over 10, and we're at about 17,500. So you get into like Anoka Hennepin, where there are, about 40,000, and then you get all the way to we're number 7. In terms of the student needs, the diversity of educational needs that we see, the geographic distance that we need to serve, those are districts that I think are a really good point of reference for us to be taking a look at, not just actually financially, but also educationally.
All right. I can't believe it's time for another break already, Kent. The hour is flying by us for sure. We'll be back in just a few minutes. More with Kent Pekel, Rochester Public Schools Superintendent, on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96. It's Rochester Today, News Talk 1340, KROC AM 96.9 FM. Andy Brownell, along with Rochester Public Schools School Superintendent Kent Pekel. Trouble saying schools today, Kent. One of the topics I wanted to discuss with you, because I don't think we've ever talked about it before, but I know you did a recent interview on public radio concerning this, and it's student absenteeism.
Yep.
Not dropping out, but not showing up either all day or for certain classes. And that was, I know, a big issue during the pandemic, especially when it was remote learning, that you had some kids just check out.
Yeah.
What's happening with kids now as far as actually showing up to school?
Well, there's just, for your listeners, there's two sides of this coin, and you have to listen carefully for which one somebody's talking about. There's chronic absenteeism, so kids who miss school a lot, or what the state actually reports is consistent attendance, which is kids who go to school 90% or more of the time. Okay. So the two sides of the same thing. But so let's use chronic absenteeism for our discussion. That means that the kid is going to school. They're missing more than 10% of the days. So they're on the other side of that 90%.
Okay.
So if you just do the basic back of the envelope math, that could be 2 days of a month. So like you could be quote unquote chronically absent if you're missing, but that is a lot. And some kids are missing a lot more. In Rochester in 2023, we had a chronic we had a consistent attendance rate. I'm sorry, I'm going to give you the flip percentage because it's what's in front of me, of 62.3%. So our kids were going 90% of the time, going to 62.3 of them were going. That's up from 53.5% in 2022. So it's a 10-point improvement in consistent attendance. We also saw a 10-point drop in chronic absenteeism. Now, one thing that's really important is in the way the state calculates that, if a kid misses one class, they're gone for the whole day.
Oh, okay.
And so we do have an issue in our middle schools and high schools with a subset of our kids not getting to, every class. So this is an issue. It's an issue that has been greatly exacerbated by the pandemic. Counties everywhere, including in Olmsted County, during the pandemic, largely got out of the truancy business almost entirely. And so it used to be, in the old days, if you were an assistant principal, you'd call a truancy officer because you had a kid who wasn't coming to school. And in most counties, everybody pulled back on that during the pandemic. And here in Olmsted County, we are very much in the midst of working with our county partners to rebuild that capacity. Because, our job is teaching the kids when they're in school and working with the parents to make sure that they get them to school. But we're not the ones that, necessarily go out and find them at the mall or, in their home. Although we do have a lot of administrators even that go above and beyond call of duty to do that. So we need community partners to do it. But we also just have to really clearly message to our kids, being in school really matters. And that even though during the pandemic, you were learning from a screen and people said stay home even if you have the sniffles, we're beyond that right now. And so we have got a new leader who's leading our work on student engagement, which includes attendance. Angie McAndrews was the principal at Kellogg Middle School until last year, and she is in the early stages of working with me and others to put together our attendance strategy. She also is going to be at the hub of our graduation rate strategy to make sure kids don't drop out and that they earn their degrees. And we're starting our work in Rochester by just trying to understand the problem, to really understand who's not coming to school, why are they not coming to school, how exactly are our schools coding that data so that we really know we have the accurate data on the problem. And then we're going to be moving into the strategy area where we need to make sure that we've got kids understanding how important it is to be in school. Because it's not only important for the kid who's missing. If you're a teacher and you have kids who are missing, it impacts your ability to meet the needs of the rest of your class because you got to catch those kids up. Or those kids don't understand the rituals and routines, or they don't know the culture of your class and stuff like that. So it's a big deal, not just for the kids who are missing, but for the kids who are in the class with the kids who are chronically absent.
You mentioned reaching out to the kids and with encouragement and finding ways to get the message to them how important it is to be in school. Does that extend to the families as well? Because there must be some awareness that your kid's not showing up to class.
Well, there is. We have to make sure that they know. We have our, like most school districts today, we have our attendance system that gives you a robocall and that you can go on a portal and look. We need to make sure that we are very proactively letting parents to know when their kid wasn't in school. We need to work with them to think about the so what, now what? Like, how are you actually going to do it? And we have many parents who, when we tell them that their son or daughter was not in class or was not in school altogether, they are very concerned and they get right on it. We do have some others who will say, and I don't want to sound like I'm throwing parents under the bus. I know it is a stressful time to be a parent. It's stressful time to be an employee in many things. But we have some parents who say, I don't know what to do with them. And, we do also have to have high expectations for our parents and caregivers. Like kids in the United States go to school between kindergarten and 12th grade 15% of the time, 85% of their waking time is outside school. And so we have a limited amount of time to get them ready for college and careers. And so when you start missing that and you're missing skills, it's a big deal. And we need to let them know it. It's actually one reason why this year, you and I talked about this before, we've gone back to giving Fs. Up until this year, it's a policy that predated me in Rochester. We gave them a no credit, which meant they didn't earn a credit. So it didn't help them get to graduation, but it didn't figure in their GPA like an F. And so we've brought that back this year to say, no, actually, this does impact your overall well-being. And so if we're not giving kids clear messages that what they do in class matters, they're adolescents. Their brains are developing. They're experiencing the social world. It's developmentally normal for them to push boundaries a bit. It's our job not to let them push them too far. But we shouldn't be surprised that they're going to, if we give them an inch, they may take more than that.
They're kids.
And they're kids. And so we have to actually have those parameters out there for them.
All right, Kent. Again, I wish we had a lot more time to chat, and I guess we'll have to continue this in about a month.
Yeah.
With another meeting of the minds right before the referendum, in fact.
That will be right before that very important moment of truth. And again, I know I say it like a broken record. I can't tell people how to vote, respect whatever decision you make, but we can urge people to get the facts. And we have a lot of information on our website at rochesterschools.org, and there's a page there, and it'll give you a lot of information about it. And we're going to keep listening to the feedback and doing our best to answer the hard questions that we get.
All right. Thanks again for your time. I appreciate it. I know our listeners do as well.
All right.
Kent Pekel, Rochester Public Schools Superintendent. This is Rochester Today. News Talk 1340, KROC AM 96.